So, what I wish I knew about scaffolding reading as a secondary teacher that I know now, these are the questions I had back then. I'm not sure I know how to help my students develop as readers and learn the content I'm responsible for. Is it really so bad if I just talk them through what they need to know in engaging ways? There were times as a high school teacher when I decided to give everybody a break from reading and just tell them what they needed to know. It's not something I'm proud of, but I felt time constraints severely and I didn't really have other approaches. So I'm really glad I know more about this now and can share it with you. I actually don't know how to teach them how to read at all. I typically just assign reading and then try to help them with it after. What should I do differently? Even as an ELA teacher, I knew how to help students analyze texts, but I didn't know how to help them read it the first time through and understand what they were reading. So these are things I know now that I'm excited to share today. And then finally, the really big question, how in the world can I support my students' reading when there are so many different reading levels in my class? This is a challenge for teachers, without a doubt, but there's some really interesting new research that can help us think about this in ways that help us support all of our students without planning 8 different lessons. So let's build that common vocabulary first so that we're on the same page. What is reading and what is reading comprehension? Ohio has a real dedication to the science of reading, and I'm guessing that you've seen this before, but if not, I'll give you just a quick overview of it. This is Scarborough's reading rope. It shows the many different components that are woven together to result in skilled reading. So we often think about reading as having 2 main factors: word knowledge, decoding words, sounding out and reading words on the page, and language comprehension, using what we know about words, word meanings, to make sense of what we're reading. Now, word recognition is more than just decoding, as you can see here, and language comprehension is more than just knowing what the words mean, but all of these pieces together are important for reading the words on the page and understanding them. That brings us to this idea of reading comprehension. If I am a skilled reader and I understand what I'm reading, what's actually happening with all that word recognition and language comprehension? Well, some seminal research done by the RAND Corporation, led by Catherine Snow back in 2002, gave us this definition, which is still quite salient. The process of simultaneously extracting and constructing meaning through interaction and involvement with written language. That's what reading comprehension is. It's not an author dumping their words and their ideas into our minds and us understanding it the same way they wrote it. When we understand what we read, when we have reading comprehension, we have all that word recognition, all of that language comprehension, and then we extract meaning from the page and we construct it. We build it back up in our minds to create what's called a situation model. We use everything we know about the topic to make meaning, to construct that meaning. And reading comprehension happens when we are interacting and staying involved with what we're reading. So it's a back and forth process between us, our minds, the text, how we're constructing what the author wrote in light of what we already know. Comprehension is interesting in that it's not just about the reader and the text. There's a third component that really impacts our comprehension. That's the activity. So this little diagram comes from that same RAND report. And what the researchers on that panel theorized was that reading comprehension involves who's the reader, everything the reader brings to the text, what is the text, and all the things the text contains, and then what's the activity or the purpose for reading? Why is the reader reading? What do they hope to gain out of it? What are they doing while they're reading? All of that impacts comprehension as well. And then the final part of this diagram is the sociocultural context. And in the sociocultural context, we're thinking about the communities in the classroom, the school, the neighborhood, the town, the country, and all of the different cultural aspects that are part of those communities. So all of that influences comprehension as well. In short, reading comprehension is very complex and very reliant on many different variables. I'm going to share with you a bit of a metaphor, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, about what it feels like when we're not really comprehending what we read. So with apologies to the Home Depot, let me share with you what I call the Home Depot effect of not comprehending what we're reading. And this directly pertains to my personal experiences. So I am not a handy person at all. I'm not very good at fixing things or figuring out what's wrong with things, but occasionally I do try to fix something that's not working in my house. Let's imagine that something has gone wrong in my house and I decide I need some type of widget to fix it, and I head off to the Home Depot, which I'll tell you straight out is a place I don't like to be. I'm not motivated to be there. I don't know a whole lot about it, and it's not a lot of fun for me, but I need my widget. So I head off to the Home Depot. I walk in the store, a little bit of a heavy heart because I know it's a place that I'm not going to feel successful in. And I start wandering the aisles. I start wandering the aisles because I don't really know what category my widget fits into. I don't really know where I'm supposed to be in the store. So I just start at the beginning and I wander up and down the aisles and I pay attention to every single thing in those aisles, hoping I'm going to find my widget. I start to get pretty tired because it's pretty hard to pay attention to every little thing. I don't know what's more important. I don't know what's less important. I might have already missed my widget. I just don't know. And I start to get pretty frustrated after about the third aisle. At that point, my options are just to leave the Home Depot altogether or to go find somebody in the orange apron and say, please just tell me where my widget is so I can leave. I'm sure everybody has experiences like this in stores or in the wilderness or in books themselves, when we start to pay attention to everything because we don't really have a system and organization in our minds about what's important and what's not, where things are and where they aren't. So that's really what it feels like when we're in a text that we're having difficulty comprehending. So I call that the Home Depot effect. Again, apologies to Home Depot, but I'm going to refer back to that because some of the things we'll talk about today will help our readers avoid the Home Depot effect in the texts we're asking them to read. The answer is scaffolding. The way to avoid that feeling of frustration, of paying attention to everything or nothing, helping our students avoid all of that is scaffolding. And we want to scaffold reading before, during, and after. That doesn't mean every before, during, and after reading scaffold is a 15-minute thing we're coming up with. It's a lot of integrated support. And some of it we're already doing in our other disciplinary activities, like building word knowledge. So if we think about scaffolding reading before reading, we want to help students build word and world knowledge on the topic they're about to read. When students have a schema, an organization for how the reading or the topic related to the reading is organized, they are better at paying attention to what's more important and discarding peripheral or less important ideas. Before reading, we also want to set a purpose for reading and explain text structure. So thinking about that activity component of the RAND model, we want to help students have a purpose. So again, they can pay attention to what's more important and spend less energy on what's less important. When students are actually in the middle of the reading, during the reading, we want to provide opportunities for students to self-regulate, to monitor their own comprehension. So that might be something as simple as after reading a set number of paragraphs, turn to your partner and answer this question together. Students then get a chance during the reading to reflect on what was important and also to recognize when they might have missed something important. Also during reading, we want to provide academic language support. And that goes back to that sentence and paragraph academic language we talked about in the last topic. Finally, after reading, we want to promote reflection on new knowledge and promote application of that new knowledge. So we want to help students look back and really firmly construct that meaning from the text, and then also think about applying that new knowledge they built as they understood what they read. This particular research study relates to the power of scaffolding, and it also relates to that question I had about how do I help my students when they're all at different reading levels? Well, I want to thank Dr. Sarah Lupo and her colleagues for doing this really important study in 2019, because they showed that with scaffolding, most readers did as well on challenging versions of a text as they did on easier versions. So there were students who got a harder version of a text and students who got an easier version that was modified to be at an easier lexile level of that same text. They provided scaffolding to all the students. The students who had the harder versions of text did just as well, comprehended just as much as the students who had the easier versions of the text. That doesn't mean that every challenging text will work for every reader, even with a certain amount of scaffolding. There were readers who actually may need the easier version. However, most of our readers and most of our classes with good scaffolding can access similar text levels. So that's something to keep in mind moving forward. But the scaffolding is the key. So here's a sample text we'll play with as we think about before, during, and after reading scaffolding. This is the final report on the WASP program. And I'm going to pull this up and leave it here for just a minute or two so you can read this on your own. Okay, so hopefully you've had a chance to read through this. It'll be a reference for you in our materials for today if you'd like it as well. Let's think about what we might do before reading to build word and world knowledge on this reading. So if this was a primary source document in a social studies class that I wanted my students to read, I might give them some word and world knowledge ahead of time. And what I would share with them was that the WASP program was the Women's Air Force Service Pilots Program. It was a program that just lasted a year, 1943 to 1944, and that was during World War II. And it was the United States of America's effort to increase the number of qualified pilots. So they ran something of a big experiment to see if women could be trained to be as skillful and effective pilots as men were. And Jacqueline Cochran is the woman who wrote the reading you just read. It was the report, the final report on the WASP program. She was a pioneer of women's aviation, and she was the director of the WASP program. And this picture is 4 of the pilots from the program who took part in the year of training. So I would make sure my students had some historical context for this. And then I would think about some important word knowledge. And at this point, I'm going to think about there's some pretty meaty, morphologically complex words in this passage that I might want to help my students with. Subsequent, determinative, selective, speculation, militarization, paralleled. Several of these words are really critical to understanding the text. And they have super cool morphemes that I can help my students build knowledge of, which will give them access to many more words. There's a number of other words in this text, like technical names of some of the airplanes. Those are words my students might not know a whole lot about, but they also don't need to do what I want them to do with the text. And so I'm going to pay attention to the words that are both critical to understanding the text and that have some cool morphemes in them that I can help my students use with future words. Before reading, I also want to set a purpose for reading and help my students explore the text structure. So I'll think about creating an anticipation guide with purpose setting and text structure questions. An anticipation guide is a set of questions. It can be true or false or short answer that students address before they read and then again after they read. So they anticipate and then they reflect after they've read. So questions I might want to ask are things like, who wrote the report? For what audience? For what purpose? How would you expect the report to be organized? What would you expect the tone of the report to be? Argumentative, dry and factual, something else? So again, trying to avoid the Home Depot effect here by helping my students pay attention to the things that will help them construct meaning from this text, as opposed to paying attention to every little thing, some good percentage of which might not help them at all. So we would do the anticipation guide, we'd play around with the words and the morphemes, and then I would have them read. Next, they're reading, and I want to promote some self-regulation, some monitoring of comprehension, and some academic language support. The text is a few pages long, so I just showed you an excerpt of it, but the text is a few pages long. So I would break that up for students, and I would ask some good questions that would help them pay attention to what is most important. So one thing that's really important about the excerpt I shared with you is that all three paragraphs are making similar claims, basically that women could be trained to be as effective and skillful as men. And that claim shows up in all three paragraphs. So I might direct my students to that, to pay attention, what similar claim. And after reading the first three paragraphs, I might have them work that out with a partner. I'm also going to encourage them or require them to use annotations. And text coding is another way to talk about annotations. But I want to make sure this is strategic. So if I give my students highlighters and say, highlight what's important, I'm not doing a whole lot to reduce the Home Depot effect. But if I say, identify similar claims, and in the margins, write an EV for evidence. Every time you see evidence for this common claim, I am directing my students to pay attention to what's important. In none of these activities am I telling my students what the claims are or what the evidence is. I am just helping them put their attention towards the parts of the text that will help them make meaning out of it. Finally, also during reading, I want to think about academic language features and giving my students opportunities to process them with some feedback. So I've pulled here in quotes one of the longer sentences from that excerpt. And you can see my prompt would be, with a partner, identify the 4 pieces of information this sentence is sharing. So this is a pretty long sentence, and it has multiple pieces of information that are hard to manage all at once. But if I give my students opportunities to tackle these sentences with a partner, with some discussion, and try to identify the pieces of information, I'm giving them the time and space that they need to deal with complex sentences, and I'm giving them a target. There are 4 pieces of information in here to pin down. The more they practice this, the better they are at grappling with complex sentences on their own. But I need to explicitly scaffold this if I want to support their development with academic language. Finally, after reading, I want to promote reflection on what they learned and also help them apply their new knowledge. So in groups, I'd have them revisit that anticipation guide we did at the beginning that was had the initial purpose setting questions. So I'd have them go back, who wrote the report? For what audience? For what purpose? I'd have them decide if their predictions were accurate, why or why not. And then I would also have them make connections to multiple sources, like this article from Forbes I've linked to on the slides, which I've included in our materials for our interactive work today as well. The article from Forbes shows contemporary biases against female pilots. And so I would have my students explore, despite the success of the WASP program, stereotypes about women pilots as inferior persist to this day. Why? So I want to help my students align patterns in history with current events now. And I also want to make sure that they have a deep understanding of what they read. And so connections across texts can help students build knowledge so that they are better at analyzing and understanding all the texts that they're reading.